the end of this video about the introduction to ecology, you'll be able to define what ecology is, identify interdependence in ecology and why that's important, and then tell me the difference between the different levels of organization in ecology. So far, what we've talked about, we've looked at how we classify organisms. We have 3 domains that are broken into 5 kingdoms. Each kingdom is broken into phyla. Phyla can be broken down into orders, orders into families, families into genus, genus into species, just like you can go through the files on the computer, from my computer to C drive, to my documents, to biology, to ecology, to LO3. It's kind of that same idea that we break down smaller and smaller and smaller. We name organisms with binomial nomenclature, a 2-part name based on Latin. And then we can use dichotomous keys to help classify organisms and identify them if we don't know what they are. Today we're going to actually start looking at living things and the aspects of their environment. The definition of ecology is simply the study of how things, living things, interact with each other and the environment around them. So this has living and non-living factors tied in together. There's this huge idea of interdependence in ecology, meaning everything is connected. If you change one thing, that's going to have a domino effect on everything else. And I got to do some research in California. I don't know if you knew about that. I went to the U9LO Coast Range Reserve, and you can see on the map where it is, and I was helping professors, so this was not my experiment, I was simply helping. Climate models project that this area of California, in response to climate change, is going to get excess rain, more rain than usual. The scientists that set up this experiment wanted to know how will the Coast Range Reserve respond to this extra rain. So the picture that looks like crop circles, what they did was they set up a variety of plots, and the bottom picture shows that they set up irrigation systems with sprinklers. Not all the plots received the extra rain, only some of them did. The ones that didn't were the control. They just got the normal rain that the meadow received. So, back in 2009, I went and I helped collect plant samples, because what we did, we would take that little, you can see the little white PVC square, and in those big circular plots, we'd pick 2 places and set down our square, use scissors, very scientific, to cut out all the plants in that little sample of the plot, and then put them in paper bags and bring them back, and we did this, like I said, for all of the plots in that area. We sorted, that's what the bottom picture is, all the different kinds of plants that were in our little bags that we collected. By doing that, we were able to see how water affected the growth, because they had been doing this experiment for a couple of years. I had only been helping with one of those years. What they found, first you have plants that are called nitrogen fixers, which means in our atmosphere, nitrogen is present, but we really can't use it. Only certain plants can take the nitrogen and fix it or make it usable. So in response to all this rain, at first the nitrogen-fixing plants became more abundant. There were more of them. Over time, the nitrogen fixers, when they died, added fertilizer to the grass, which was good. So the grass grew very, very tall, and were able to outcompete other forbs. Now, forb is another name for a non-grass plant, so the wildflowers. The forbs became less abundant, and because certain organisms depended on those forbs for their habitat or food, species diversity began to decrease, not only of the plants that were there, but also the other organisms, like I said, that relied on those forbs. So, interdependence. If you change the amount of rain, you're changing the producers in that area. If you're changing the producers, you're affecting the animals that eat the producers. If you're affecting the herbivores that eat the plants, then you're affecting the predators that eat the herbivores, and so on and so forth. Interdependence is a huge theme in ecology. Ecology can be really difficult to study, as I alluded to before, and you couldn't introduce climate change to this area. It's not possible to see what happens. So we had to use models and small-scale experiments to figure this out. Model use is very limited. You can't account for everything because you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Maybe the climate change model was correct, but something changes along the way, and so that area actually doesn't get as much rain as predicted, well, now that just threw off all of your experimental results. So you can only use a model up to a certain point. Well, here are some levels of organization within ecology. We talked about these words at the beginning of the year. The first is the biosphere. The biosphere is the thin volume of the Earth and the atmosphere that can support life. A fun little fact, and this is why that apple picture is on the side. If the Earth and the atmosphere were the apple, the biosphere would only be as thick as the skin. So most of the Earth cannot support life. It's only just that thin outer layer and the atmosphere. Getting smaller, the biosphere is broken into ecosystems. An ecosystem consists of all the living and the non-living things in a certain place. So in this picture you have the trees, the bears, wolves, poison ivy, other plants. You have the things that you can't really see because they're so small, worms, flies, and then you have non-living stuff, air, water, temperature, rocks, soil. There's so much more, but I just picked a small amount to get my point across. Getting smaller, a biosphere is broken into ecosystems. An ecosystem can be broken into a community. A community is just looking at the living things in that area. So before we looked at the air, the water, the temperature, now this takes that away. The community only includes the living stuff. Communities can be broken even smaller, so now you can see all these species. We had the trees, the brown bears, the wolves. Population is looking at only one of those groups at a time. Population, all of the members of a given species in an area. So let's say it's all the brown bears in this forest. We have our species, we have our area. Getting smaller, we can look at an organism. An organism is just one member of that species. So this is the brown bear that looks really lonely because he's only one member of the species. So I'm just going to go back up the list real quick. We have an organism. Organisms together make up a population. Put together multiple populations, you get a community. Put together the community plus the non-living stuff in an area, you get an ecosystem. Put together all the ecosystems in the world, and you get the biosphere. To wrap up this section, you're going to conference with me. A couple things. You have a food chain here. You have a plant that goes to an insect, a grasshopper, to a rodent, the mouse, to the snake, to the bird. Be prepared to talk about interdependence. I'm going to ask you some questions about it. So think about how are all of these things interconnected? What would happen if I change one thing or wipe somebody out? Okay, be ready to answer questions. Also, be prepared to define any of the vocab words so far. I gave you a list. They're in your notes. You should be able to tell me them in your own words without the use of notes.